series, to the third of our series of Jewish artists that had an outsized impact on American modernism. We talked first about Ben Shahn, then about Mark Rothko, today about Louise Nevelson, and on May 26th, if everybody notes, we had to postpone that because of scheduling issues. We're going to talk about Helen Frankenthaler. And the interesting thing is they all knew each other. They were all working in the same mixing pot of art in New York City. And in fact, Mark Rothko was very close friends to Louise Nevelson, one of the closest of the artists that she grew up with. And apparently she was with Rothko 2 days before he committed suicide. And that relationship was really important to her. We're going to talk about Louise Nevelson. And Jerry, let's do the first slide.
Let me share my screen.
Do I have to hit got it? Yeah, I will. Okay.
Do you see my screen?
I see it in the top right. Okay, there we are. No, but that is.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so here is Louise Nevelson. It's 1971. She's on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. She is at the height of a career that has been nothing but ascendant, and she's at the top of her game. Her monumental wood sculptures are in collections all over the country and world, and she innovated the first wall sculptures as well as freestanding sculptures made entirely of wood and waste wood at that, detritus that she would pick up from all over the city and her world, and her house was stuffed with it. She mastered by this time, after experimenting with it, the art of metal sculpture. And in 1971, the same year, she will show her first two, one made of black enameled aluminum and the other made of Corten steel, which is what she pretty much did all of her subsequent work. And that piece, by the way, her first installed Corten steel sculpture called Atmospheres and Environments, you can see right in front of the library at Princeton University, which I actually saw 2 days ago. I forgot entirely. I was walking down the street and I look at the corner of my eye and I say, that looks like a Nevelson. And it was. And it turns out that it's the first installation in metal in Corten steel that she did. In any event, she is now famous, and she has drawn praise far and wide for her work. I mean, at any given show, there's critics and there's different views, but by and large, she's recognized as one of America's greatest sculptors, right there at the top with Calder and Noguchi and David Smith. Louise Nevelson is there in that company. And I just thought writing in the New York Times was of a 1971 exhibit. He writes, Louise Nevelson's new exhibition proves once again that the woman cannot be trusted. For years now, from show to show, she has implicitly capped off her career with a final demonstration of her power, but each following year comes up with something very new. It's very wearying for us art reporters. And I think when we go through this presentation, which I'll try to do with reasonable dispatch, you will see the evolution of her work decade to decade. But before we do that, I thought it would be interesting to meet Ms. Nevelson, or Mrs. N, as she liked to be called, in this very same year, with excerpts of an interview that was done with her that I think you'll find amusing. Here's Mrs. N.
Art was all that mattered to me at all times, right from the beginning. I remember going to the library one day. I couldn't have been more than 9. And the librarian asked me what I was going to be. And I replied, I'm going to be an artist. No, I added. I am going to be a sculptor because I don't want color to help me. I wouldn't marry God if he asked me. The gifts of motherhood were the worst guilts in the world for me. They were truly insurmountable. I think people should think a million times before they give birth.
Walk away. Hear it.
During the war, there was a shortage of materials. I decided that creativity was the most important thing. And I began to see things, almost anything along the street, as art. I wanted the form, and I didn't care about the carving. I wanted something more immediate. I found this box on the street. It was rather long. Imagine placing objects in a space. I just nailed them together in my box, and I knew it was art. Black is the most aristocratic color, the only aristocratic color for me. This is the ultimate. There is no other color that will give you that feeling of greatness, of quietness, of peace, of excitement. But the whites move out a little bit into outer space with a lot more freedom. And then came the gold. When you invite gold in, it takes you over. This is how I would sum up my life as an artist. I just did my work, which was a marvelous thing. My whole life is art, and art is everywhere, except it has to pass through a creative mind.
Okay. Pretty marvelous, wouldn't you say? What a character. Somebody, again, I can't think of another artist, and we'll talk about this later, that was as well known for their personality, for their style, for their presence, as well as their art, and being a great artist as Louise Nevelson. So let's look at her from the beginnings. She was born in an ancient city in the Ukraine called Pereyaslav. A few days after her birth, allegedly, Stoller, who's the famous author of Yiddish tales, was visiting his sister next door to the Berliawskys, and understood that there was a new birth next door. And he went and he saw the little girl, he met the parents, and he pronounced, "This child is destined for greatness." And Minna, her mother, would repeat this to her entire childhood. And she would repeat it to herself, that she was destined for greatness. This is her family, her father, Isaac, Minna, she's the oldest of 4 kids. Lillian is the youngest, Nathan, and Anita. And the interesting thing as we look at this family is that while she took the loss of her father, who died in 1946, and her mother, who died in 43, took it very hard, she didn't go to their funerals. And it's really hard to explain because she was affected profoundly. And maybe because of that, she couldn't bring herself to. But the children rallied, her siblings rallied around her entire life. Nathan grew up to be a relatively prosperous merchant in Rockland, where they grew up, and supported her through a lot of her adult life. And Lillian and Anita became her best friends and traveled the world with her, Europe, the Yucatan, Mexico. So a pretty extraordinary family, one would have to say. So Isaac leaves for America and ends up in Rockland in 1901. The rest of the family, once he's established himself and made enough money to take care of them, they come in 1905. This is a picture when they're in Rockland in 1906. Apparently, Louise never fully got over her father's leaving the family. And it's said that she stopped speaking for 6 months after he departed. He gets to Rockland. He sells rags, scraps, just like a lot of Jewish immigrants. Whatever he could find, he collects antiques and stuffs a whole house with them, which is a behavior replicated by Louise later on. But he starts building houses, and before very long, I mean, it took a while, he becomes a major landowner in Rockland. That said, anti-Semitism in Rockland was extremely significant, much to a shock to me. This is Maine, it's Rockland. This is where, everybody seems to be free and just don't give me a problem. Well, Jews were a problem, and they felt it in their community. Louise talked about it and was embittered by it. And she talks about her mother. They were very poor for a long time. And she talks about her mother parading down the street, dressed to the nines, would dress the kids to the nines, even though they had, that's all their money was spent on their clothes. But she wanted to be who they were. And that is something that stayed with Louise her whole life, and I think does account for some of her flamboyance in her last 20 years or so. Our mother was very clear that nobody was going to overshadow this family with their bias. Here she is in high school. Picture on the left, she's the tallest of the girls, so of course she becomes the captain of the girls' high school basketball team. She also excelled in art and in singing. And here she is, 1913, so she's 14 years old, and she's fourth from the left. Next. The picture at the left is a picture of a statue of Joan of Arc. This was in front of the library in Rockland. And this is something that Louise says she passed by the first time she looked at it. She was so struck by it that this was a sculpture of this famous person that was embodying somehow the emotion or the drama of this moment. And she says that she decided then and there she's going to become a sculptor. Next to this are the first drawings that at least we have. They're from 1906. She is 7 years old, and she is drawing furniture with a little wastebasket to the right, some items on the center table, and somebody sitting in a big chair to the left with a chandelier and other lights. This already indicates that she has this interesting interest in furniture and in assembly, and has a sense of composition, which is really what will define her. Next. In school, her aptitude in art, and these were done when she's in high school, was recognized early on. And the one and only art teacher that they had in the Rockland school right through high school was a woman named Lena Cleveland, who had a profound influence on her. She had gone to Pratt Institute in New York, and Louise was very impressed that she had gone to New York City to study art. And but she took a deep interest in Louise's work, almost exclusively worked with Louise throughout her time in high school. Next. Here's some other work that she did. a little more sophisticated, again, focusing on this assembly of furniture in a single composition on the one on the left and right, and then focusing on the chair and the spindles and the rail back and the style, which continued to interest her whole artistic life. She loved these pieces of these chairs, and she knew the difference in all of the styles. This is Louise, 17 years old. Next. Here's her work is becoming more sophisticated. You can see that, from her training, she, is extending her reach. And this is just an example of this artist in the making, although at this point, she's not a sculptor. It's as far from her mind. She's a visual artist and she's learning her craft. Next. Well, she graduates high school in 1920, and she works as a ticket taker at the local cinema. She's determined to go to New York, but in the meanwhile, she's sort of biding her time in this town of Rockland that she wants to escape from. Well, her ticket shows up in Charles Nevelson. Charles Nevelson is introduced to her by his brother, who had met her previously, and she was, by all accounts, beautiful, and was considered beautiful through really the entirety of her life. But Charles gets introduced to her. He wants a wife. He's a wealthy ship owner. Here is a beautiful young woman. He asks her hand in marriage on their first date, and lo and behold, they get married. And while he is not necessarily the perfect match for her in any respect, he's dour, he's conservative, he's shorter than she is, he's 5'4", he's plump, he's balding, he's twice her age. Perfect, right? But he's a rich ship owner. He comes from a very wealthy family. They are millionaires, and he's taking her to New York, and off they go to New York. Next.
Would everyone please mute someone's,
Yes, some background noise.
yep, I can't see who it is. Sorry.
Okay. I'm glad I'm the one talking because it's usually me unmuted. So she, unfortunately, in her view, and she really is chagrined by this, she gets pregnant and she gives birth to Myron Nelson, who becomes known as Mike Nevelson. Here he is at 1.5, and here he is at 15. And she did talk about it a little bit, her feelings about marriage and being a mother, and she was not a good mother. She spent years away from her son and felt guilty all the while. And he would be writing her all the time that he was growing up, all the time that he was in the Merchant Marine, all the time that he was trying to become a sculptor himself throughout her life. And in the end, when she basically willed all of her work to him, it became the basis of a huge litigation and really an unfortunate result for her reputation and for her art, because he ended up keeping it locked up for almost 10 years. We're not going to talk about that today. It's another story, but that was a troubled, complicated relationship for all of her life. And yet he was always sort of loyal to the idea, at least, of her as his mother. And he also gave her money in times when she was broke. So sad story, but that's the way it is. And that she called it in her video. She was not meant to be a mother. Next. Okay, 1930s. Louise Nevelson is on the launch pad. By the end of the 30s, she will have divorced Nevelson. He runs into financial problems that are ruinous. They end up moving from their, very commodious home in Westchester to Brooklyn, and everything becomes very tight. And she is not only unhappy as a mother, she's very unhappy as a wife. And she begins, as soon as they get to New York, she enters the Art Student League. And we're going to cover Art Student League. We're going to cover a trip to Europe, meeting Hans Hofmann, her work with the WPA, meeting Diego Rivera. But let's start in 1924, next. She studies with Teresa Bernstein, a very well-recognized artist and one known to perhaps a number of you. And this is the kind of work that she is learning and, looks quite accomplished. And Bernstein recalls her as being, and she has a lot to say about her, but the thing that stood out for me is that she was a column of vibrating development. Next. She studies with both Kenneth Hayes Miller and also with Kimon Nicolaides. And she studies with them for nearly the entire time she's at the Art Student League. And she becomes quite fluent in her drawing, among other things, in all her forms of composition. But I thought these two drawings were, really interesting and showed how fluid she is in her line and how interesting you can see so many different influences, whether it's Klee or Matisse or Picasso, which obviously were influences to Nicolaides and Miller, but how confident she is in both of them in her drawing skill. Again, it's always interesting, these artists that become famous for their architectural, sculptural work became accomplished, ran the traps of learning and education as artists first. Next. These are two that she did. She's now gone to Europe. This is while she was at Art Student League, she goes to Europe and she really wants to study with Hans Hofmann. These are a couple of pieces, neither of which I think are very impressive. The one is sort of an expressionist landscape, and the other is like a Chaim Soutine Picasso guitar in the middle of what? I don't know. But here she comes back from Europe and she's plying her trade. But let's go to the next because we want to pick it up. Well, here are two other pieces when she comes back from Europe. She's met with Diego Rivera. She met him because he's in America doing his murals, and she becomes very close friends with him and Frida Kahlo, and she does this portrait of him, which I think is quite excellent. And 2 years later, or 3 years later, she does this portrait of herself, a self-portrait, which I think is wonderful. This is in the Jewish Museum. At this time, the year before, 1931, she goes to Europe specifically to study with Hans Hofmann, because while she's at the Art Student League, he is the rage. Everybody's talking about Hans Hofmann, who I personally like a lot as well. But, he is the great arbiter. He is the one who can interpret this new cubism for all the artists, and they are all in, and they're all going to Europe and they're trying to study with him. So what does Louise Nevelson do? She's still married, of course. She deposits her son with her mother, and her family, one way or the other, funds her trip to Munich. She goes to Munich. She enters in Hofmann's class, which is already crowded and there's no room for her, but she insists. And of course, she pisses off Hofmann, who within 6 months tells her her work is no good, go home. She is crushed. This is the whole reason that she has come to Europe, and she's rejected by the great Hans Hofmann. She stays in Europe for 11 months before she comes home. And interestingly, she performs in plays and sings on local stages in Munich and around Europe, has a great time. She comes home. She's home for just a few months and she decides she needs to go back. She goes back to Europe. She now takes a real tour of art in Europe and especially in France. She comes back home, enters the Art Students League again, and lo and behold, there's Hans Hofmann. He's teaching. She joins his class again and is determined to prove her worth to him. And by the end of the class, he acknowledges that she has great talent. So it's pretty satisfying for her. What she really sees, and this especially comes from Diego Rivera, is somebody that embodies the committed life of an artist, and this is what she wants. He also has this great experience with and taste for pre-Columbian art and Latin American art, and the kind of art that she finds later on she is really drawn to, particularly when she visits Mexico and the Yucatan. Next. 1934, she, as well as many of the American artists, and they include all of the New York City artists, Gottlieb, Gorky, Alice Neal, Mark Rothko, David Smith, Jackson Pollock, William de Kooning, they are all now working for the government, for Works Progress Administration, the WPA. And she is also enlisted in that, both as it appears maybe as a sculptor, but also as a teacher. While she's in the WPA, she meets Ellen Kearns, who is one of the lead dance instructors in New York. They become fast friends, and she loves dance, studies with her for years, but the dance features in her sculpture very noticeably over the next 5 or 6 years. Next. This is some of the work that she's doing in the WPA, and this is actually painted plaster work. This is Girl Reading, 1936, Mother and Child, 1937. Next, Jerry. The Dancer, 1938, the self-portrait. This is the kind of work they're doing. They're plaster pieces. She uses color in them to emphasize and de-emphasize planes in these cubed off forms, echoing Picasso's Cubism. And the one thing that she said about Picasso, who was her god, he was the top for her, was more important for her than the cube was his sense of composition, which she took to heart. During this time of 34 to 39, she exhibits 7 times in New York, winning recognition along the way, selected for juried honors, getting good notices, particularly by several of the New York City art critics who follow her career and continue to extol the virtues of her work even early on. Especially Emily Gunheimer, who was with the New York World Telegram, who saw her particular talent. Next. Okay, 1940s, we have Ignition. In this decade, she becomes represented by the Nierendorf Gallery, one of the most prestigious galleries in the city. She applies herself to terracotta works, which she becomes superb at, and does over her time over 1,000 terracotta works. Her mother dies in 1943, which is a great blow to her. And by the end of the decade, she travels to the Yucatan with her sister and really has her mind blown, and it figures in her work. Next. This is a little ahead of us, but before we get to the circus, which this is, in 1941, she doesn't have a gallery. She's a new artist. She wants to know who's the best gallery in the city and is told it's the Nierendorf Gallery. She goes to Nierendorf. Now, this may be according to her, not sure, but she apparently goes to Nierendorf, says he must see her work and he must represent her. Now, she is very beautiful. He is very attracted to her. And apparently over the 7 years that they worked together, He is a not frequent, but occasional lover. And she has many lovers. While she's in poverty, Alice Neal once asks her how she can afford to be so well dressed. She's so broke. And she says, well, it's fucking, my dear, fucking. She did apparently plenty of that, and including with Nierendorf. So Nierendorf goes to see her work. He says, do you have more? She takes him to the basement where it is jammed to the rafters with her sculptures. He takes her on. He does her first show in 1941, where he's showing almost exclusively her WPA work. She gets very positive reviews. And one review, which is really a famous review from this 1941 show, I forget the critic, but he says, we learned the artist is a woman in time to check our enthusiasm. Had it been otherwise, we might have hailed these sculptural expressions as surely by a great figure among the moderns. So shows a little bit of where misogyny still reigned and still does. In this slide, this is from 1943, and I think this is quite marvelous. She does an assembly of 28 sculptures. She calls it the circus, with the clown is the center of the world. And she arranges all of this in a circus. Not that all of these beasts and creatures would be circus animals, but she calls it a circus, and she puts the clown, which is figurative, at the center of the exhibition. And I think a fantastic example on the right is this bull. And if you look at the bull, well, the body is a headboard. The horns and the front legs are a simple chairback. And the legs at the back are the legs of a chair. This is all constructed furniture, and it really is giving evidence of not only her creativity, but really her signature achievement of using waste materials, throwaway materials, to create art and to give them life. Next. This is more from the circus. Here is a tightrope walker on the left. Here is I don't know what in the middle. Here is sort of part of the exhibit. She did these freeform metal sculptures with sculpture on its face. She was incredibly creative, and this exhibit knocked people out. Again, this was one of Nierendorf's biggest shows, and it was actually shown inside another gallery, but it was under his name. And she was really stamping her identity as not only being creative, but 1943, this is the beginning of really the surrealism movement in New York City, imported from France. And she takes it on full body. Very enthusiastic. Next. This is called Sculptor Montage. This is 1944. Again, the backdrop of the World War, when gives birth to surrealism, Dadaism, and various forms of non-representational art, really before abstract expressionism per se, but her work is an example of the kind of work that you were seeing and she was embracing. Her first work that she actually gets entered in a museum, which is a funny story, is she's walking down the street and she sees this shoe shine guy. I think his name was Molino or something, and she's knocked out by it. It is completely bejeweled, every inch of it. It's this wild showpiece that is his box that he works from. And she says to him, would you come with me? And he says, yeah, where are we going? She says, we're going to MoMA. They go to MoMA. She meets with Dorothy Miller, who's one of the directors, who brings him to Alfred Barr, who is the director of MoMA, and they agree to show this shoebox as part of their exhibition for the Christmas season a la Duchamp. Next. So this is her leap into the future. She is taking what she imagines, she's taking found objects, she's creating these figures. Some of them are moving objects, some of them are rolling features. She's filled this gallery with what she's called a sculpture, forget the name of her show, but this is her strong entry into surrealism. Continued. Next, Jerry. More examples of her surreal sculptures, which are strange figures, which are Paul Klee-like figures, which are Miro-like figures. Next. More of the same, and next. And this is a tabletop of many of these figures as it was shown in the gallery. It's not a tabletop. This is probably 20 by 15 of these sculptures that she was doing in 1945. And she's continued in this surrealistic sculpture montage. And what she says about it and what she recalls is that she says, it was almost like you were breathing the air of surrealism in the 1940s. And the one tenet that stayed with her was working quickly, assuming that speed would help her channel her intuitive and aesthetic choices as she worked, which was very much part of the surrealistic creed, and which is something that she did her whole career, whether she was working with these small objects, whether she was building big wall sculptures, whether she was building large sky-reaching metal sculptures, she worked fast and intuitively. Next. 1950s, we have Launch. She meets Colette Roberts, who really gives her her great, really threshold show in 1958, which includes Sky Cathedral and Moon Garden 1, and then gives way to Martha Jackson, a commercial gallerist who really helps her continue her trajectory. Next. So, okay, these are two portraits that she does in the 50s. She actually does this after she and her sister go in 1950 and then back again in 1951 to Mexico, where they meet with Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, and they go through the Mayan ruins in Mexico City and Guatemala. And she, all through her career, she is still doing etchings and working in other contexts. And these are some that really reflect how taken she is with this idea of royalty and monumental sculpture. And these could be the heads on stelae that might have been 20 and 30 feet tall in the Yucatan. 1947, Nierendorf dies. Her father dies shortly before him in 1946. She is despairing without Nierendorf, who has been her guide. And that's when she really travels first to Europe with her sister and then to Mexico. She's introduced to the Sculptor Center while she is experiencing this trauma, and where she develops her terracotta figures, of which she does hundreds between 1948 and 53. And we saw some of the examples earlier of these simple, primitive forms. It was just an outpouring from her that really related to her grieving, her confusion without, her mentor and without her father. When she comes back from Mexico, she's incredibly inspired by the majesty, next, Jerry, by the majesty of the ruins, by the 30-foot stelae, by the royalty that she sees, the tombs. Then she goes and visits Max Weber, and they visit the Museum of Natural History. And I don't think I have the book. Anyway, I'm probably running late on time. He writes the most beautiful thing as he and she go to the Museum of Natural History and they revisit these Mexican artifacts and rooms in their majesty. and he shares with her, this is not primitive art. This is magnificent art. This is as high as any civilization has ever reached. And she feels the same way. She now is being represented by Colette Roberts. Colette Roberts runs the Grand Central Galleries. It's a not-for-profit, but she's a brilliant woman. They become fast friends for the rest of Nevelson's life. And she sponsors in her galleries these next several exhibitions where you start to see now that she is the queen of assemblage. She is assembling these environments, why she also becomes called the first environmental sculptor, because she is now thematic, she's environmental, she is assembling these majestic sculptures. These sculptures, you see the high ones are as much as 15 feet tall, and nobody's ever seen anything like this. It really kind of blowing the mind of the New York City art critics. Next. This is the next installation she does, which is an entire forest, as she calls it, surrounding a village that some say was much like or reminded one or could have been the kind of village shtetl that she came from, which she denied really the whole of her life. In fact, she denied that she ever created the village. But this is called the forest, incredibly inspiring. That is to the right of the scene is Nevelson standing next to the first personage, one of the sculptures there to the right in this environment that she's created. And again, this is something that the New York City art world had never seen before. Hilton Kramer, who is one of the great art critics, and if you want to read her biography, it feels like half of it is filled with his reviews and reflections on Louise Nevelson, who he thought was one of the greatest of all the artists of America. But he went through this exhibit and he said, you really must enter the shadows that she's created before you can really see what this is. Next. This is her studio in the East 30s. It looks reasonably well contained, although it has her sculpture all over the place. Later, we're going to see her studio when she moves, and it's about 20 years later, I think, and there's no furniture at all. It's only her sculpture and artwork and random pieces, which we'll see. She moves from here in 1958, and when she moves, she empties all the furniture on the street. Anybody can have it. And she loads all of her sculpture in this apartment and invites everybody to come see it. And in many cases to take what they want. One of the artists that goes, looks and says, there are just pieces, chests, coffins, boxes. It's like being in a Kafka house. Next. While she's working, she works all the time. And to amuse herself, she does these small pieces of which these are examples. And I think they're charming and amazing, both based on the same baseball bat. One standing upright, where she takes two pieces of curved wood and calls it sailing. The next, where she has the baseball bat horizontal and more maybe the center of the piece, she calls the game. But beautiful, elegant, simple work based on found pieces. Next. This is Sky Cathedral. She's about to hit the city in the art world like a bombshell. She makes this in 1957. This is monumental in size. It's 15 feet high by 10. And it is boxes filled with artifacts, filled with pieces of wood, of things she's picked up. Every one is like a separate study and montage. And it is massive, and it is to become embodied in the next year with a signature piece to that point, which is what's called Moon Garden and One. Next. This is Moon Garden and One. impossible to appreciate what it is on this black and white two-dimensional picture. But you go inside it, and the entire thing, and this is the first time that she's done all black, which she says creates harmony, doesn't intrude on the emotions. She has 116 individual boxes fused together, all filled with wood pieces that she's been collecting for years. And you walked into it, and the light is very low. After all, there's a moon garden, and there's a moon, there's moonlight, and you're enveloped. I wish I could have been in there. The viewer is enveloped in a dark garden of shapes and shadows within this arena of monuments. Next. She goes from Colette Roberts, who really can't pay her. She's a not-for-profit. And she understands when Nevelson goes to the Martha Jackson Gallery. Martha Jackson's a major figure in New York City. She's hungry to take Nevelson on as a client. She agrees to pay her $20,000 up front with a stipend. There's no way that Nevelson could or should turn her down. Her first show with Martha Jackson in 1959 is called Sky Columns Presence. The reactions are favorable. She's called the Grand Mistress of the Marvelous. Dorothy Miller sees this show, walks through it, and again, this is an environment. This is a theme. This is not a single piece of sculpture, or even a set of several pieces. This is a whole environment. Dorothy Miller invites her, even though she's about 60 years old at this point, she invites her to be included in the show at MoMA called 16 Americans, which are the 16, in MoMA's view, greatest American artists, modern artists. And in the show is Jasper Johns, and Ellsworth Kelly, Robert Rauschenberg, Frank Stella, and others. She is 20 years older than the oldest of them, and she's probably the most well-known, the most powerful presence at this point on the art scene. So she has a tremendous show next. Actually, I'll show, this is, I forgot, this is the show she does at MoMA. It's her first foray into white. Here she's just become famous and rocked everybody's world with her black sculptures. She's invited to do something for MoMA, and she tells Dorothy Miller, I want to do something, but it's going to be all white. And she calls it Dawn's Wedding Feast. And it's debuted in 1959 at the Museum of Modern Art. It's a whole surround room. You can't see all of it, but it's apparently just, you know, an amazing work. And many of the pieces from this show up later in her very famous work, which we'll talk about, called the Nevelson Chapel in St. Peter's Church, which is one of the main destination points for thousands of New Yorkers and tourists each year. We'll see it later. Next. So this is 1960s. She is now famous and she is in flight. She is now going to decide to work in gold now that she's done black and white. She jumps from Martha Jackson to Sidney Janis, stupidly. Why? Because Janis represents de Kooning and Rothko, her buddies. Janis takes her on. It's a disaster. We won't spend much time on it, but it causes her to sort of descend into a real depression of the mistake she made and the litigation she got into. The same year that she joins up with and gets rid of Janis, she is invited as one of 4 Americans to the Venice Biennale. We'll look at her piece for that. While she's so depressed because she doesn't now have a gallerist representing her because she quits Janis, she doesn't have Jackson. She goes to a place called Tamarind and does these marvelous terracottas. She meets at this time Arnie Glincher, who's to become her gallerist for the rest of her life. And she is as responsible for the founding of the Pace Gallery as he is. She does collages, which we'll see throughout her life and career. And by the end of the 60s, she's done her first steel sculptures. Next. Garrett, yeah. This is her her living room on East 30th Street in 1955. This is her living room in 1965 in her new house in Spring Street. That is her living room. There's no furniture there. There is no hanging art. There is just all of the stuff that she's gathering and collecting and picking up that she uses for her sculpture. Next. As I mentioned, she spends 3 months at Tamarin doing lithography as well as doing small sculptures, but she really becomes an expert lithographer, and it takes her mind off the collapse of her relationship with Janice and everything else that has troubled her. She starts working with a new assistant in 1960, Diana McGowan, who becomes her lifelong friend and assistant for the next 25 years. In 1962, at the Venice Biennale, before she goes to Tamarin, she exhibits Voyage. And she goes to Venice with Arnie Glimcher. People think he's representing her, not yet, but soon to be. So next. This is actually before the Biennale. This is something that she's done in 1961 while she was still with Colette Roberts, and called Royal Tides. We couldn't capture the whole room. The whole room is gold. You could walk in there and think you went to heaven. I just put 2 pieces of the same together, but she paints all of her monumental sculpture in gold. She says the reality of gold is alchemy. She's still hungry for money. It could have also represented in her old Yiddish days gelt that she was wishing for. Colette Roberts says her shift to gold was a momentary shift reflecting her harmony with unseen forces. Next. This is what she shows. It's actually black, looks white here, but it's black. What she shows at the Venice Biennale. It is called Voyage. It is room length, I think 25 feet by 12, and it represents at its finest her creation of boxes put together as well as monumental sculpture. All the influences up to now that she's had are wrapped up in this piece, and it's a smash in Venice. Next. In she becomes, she joins Arnie Glimcher, and he opens the Pace Gallery, and he gives her her first show in New York. He's already shown a lot of her work to shows around the country where he has other relationships as well as London, and her work is now selling out of sight. Everything is selling. He gives her her first show in New York with the Pace, and this is the centerpiece of the show called Homage to 6 Million, and it's actually Homage to 6 Million 1. This is 2, which is in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And obviously, even though she's never really talked much that I can see about the Holocaust, it is not far from her heart and sensibility, and this is her homage to the Holocaust and the first piece that Glimcher shows of her work. Next. These are the next 2. You can look at this, and then Jerry, the next one. These are collages that she's done her whole life, made of pieces of wood and plywood and textured materials and plastic, and that she does right up until the time she dies. And there are some recent exhibitions that I've been reading about which show hundreds of her collages, which are quite marvelous. But the things that she does almost absentmindedly to amuse herself. Next. She's now working in metal. And just to back up a little bit, in 1964, she starts working with other materials. She's working with plastics, with plexiglass. She starts to work with metal. Arnie brings her to Victoria Fabricators They are working in aluminum and she's playing around with it. He then introduces her a little later to Core-10 steel manufacturers who are major players, which we'll come to, which is called Lippincott. But now she's working with metal. The piece you see here actually is installed in 1971, and it's her first major steel installed sculpture, and it's at Princeton, and you can see it. If you walk down Nassau Street and look into Princeton at the library, there it is front and center, about 20 feet tall, and it's magnificent. And she did this, started thinking about it in 64. She did it in 1971. Next. Okay. I was going to say at the same time she started working in black enameled aluminum, but I think we'll get to it here. 1970s, she's soaring. She's now involved in public art. She's reaching higher and higher as she learns and masters this Core-10 steel structure. And she does her 3 signature works before the end of her life: Mrs. N's Palace, the Nevelson Cathedral, and Nevelson's Plaza. Next. That's her and Artie Glimsher. Next. Here she is at Lippincott. And at Lippincott, they were amazed. Just like she was with her wood sculpture, as she was with metal, she was fully involved with the work. She was picking up metal scraps all over their yard and inside their building and using it for her sculptures. Nothing was ready-made for her work. It was all based on stuff that was being thrown away or that was scrapped. Next. These again, it's called End of Day. These are 3 separate pieces. These are things, again, just like her collages that she was doing to amuse herself. Next. In 1971, she does her first or second, if you count the core steel at Princeton metal sculpture. And these, it's called her 7th decade garden. She's in her 7th decade. And these are trees that are made of black enameled aluminum. And it's part of her atmospheres and environment, of which she did numerous variations. Next. Now we're getting into every year, year after year, she did major work, especially for New York City. This is called Night Presence that you can see on Park Avenue and 92nd Street now. It's quite marvelous and it's massive. I should have had some people standing under it and you'd see how big it is. Next. This is called Sky Covenant, which she did for Temple Israel of Boston. This is about 20 feet tall by 15 wide. And each metal box, much like her wooden boxes, have different remnants of steel and different variations and different styles, all of which she had in her head as she was doing it. Next. This is a massive sculpture she did at MIT. She was selected by I.M. Pei, who designed the whole plaza. It became kind of controversial because a lot of the students were sort of defacing it with graffiti, and it was incredibly alarming. So a meeting was arranged with Nevelson and the students, and that was the end of graffiti on the steel sculpture. Next. This is her famous Mrs. N's Palace. And this you can see at the Met today. It takes up a whole room. It's incredible. It is 12 by 20 by 15. It's a walk-in black sculpture that summons a house with a black gridded and mirrored floor and a black backyard garden. This is her private world. It's like a palace on the one hand, which she believes she merited. It's also like a tomb, and she was obsessed with the tombs that she saw of the kings and queens, like a box coffin. It's filled, every inch of it, inside and out, external, internal, with the remnants of her life's work, affixed to every inch of this carpenter constructed box. She had in mind a plan where inside and out, floor, ceiling, walls, displayed sculpture. the product of a life's work. And again, this is something, when you go to the Met next, ask where Mrs. N's palace is. I'm sorry to admit that I haven't seen it yet. I was going to try to make a dash for it today, but then I wouldn't have been able to do the presentation. But my understanding is it's magnificent. We had a great video done by the Met, but they blocked our being able to show it. Next. And next. Here is another of her great works. It's the Chapel of the Good Shepherd at St. Peter's Church. The entire chapel is surrounded by Nevelson's work in white, which came from a lot of places, including her Dawn's wedding feast. And we have next, Jerry, you can see a couple of the pieces that are featured in it. Next. And we have here, we're going to hear for a few minutes from Arnie Glimsher about this very special piece.
The Nevelson Chapel is an oasis for me to go in the middle of a frantic, busy day and sit there for a few minutes. It re-energizes me. Louise Nevelson is a dynamo. You know, she was a woman who believed in breaking boundaries. Nevelson was the woman of astonishing style and taste. And she changed a lot in the history of art. Ultimately, over the years, she became part of the family, and she's one of the artists that I owe my career to. She was a citizen of the world, but she was the ambassador from New York. She was a part of the landscape of New York more than anything else. You couldn't walk down the street with Nevelson without people stopping her. Nevelson is an artist who fed off of the energy, beauty, and detritus of the city. She picked up broken pieces of furniture. She would use them in her sculpture. She was not interested in the identity of the pieces at all as they existed, which some artists were. She was interested in the forms, the persistence and continued life of forms. Louise thought she could do a space for New York where people would come into this Catholic church and feel comfortable that the space was for meditation, that you would create a space of pure beauty, and she designed every element of it. And that's how it came about. And it is an astonishing piece of work. It's all about light and purity. All great work is timeless. It becomes part of the march of history and the march of aesthetics. And her work from the 50s and 60s is more beautiful and poetic today. Everything New York is what she was, especially now, where we're coming out of a very difficult time and healing is going to be very important, and it's a place to heal. PACE has financially supported the renovation, but there's a lot more that needs to be done and several more $1 million that need to be raised. And I'm hoping that people realize how much they need the Nevelson Chapel now more than ever. I hope you will join me.
Okay.
Okay, Jerry. Next. Okay, so, and by the way, it is completed. They raised the money. It's magnificent. I again can't attest to that personally. That was also part of my foolish thought of a mad dash to New York today. But I can tell you that it's high on my list. And it joins Matisse with the Matisse Chapel and St. Paul de Vence, and the Rothko Chapel in Houston that we talked about last week, and the Nevelson Chapel. When you ask, these are the three chapels in the world created by and are singular representations of the work of great artists. This is a stamp that was issued in the year 2000. The city was also honoring Nevelson. It renamed a plaza that she created downtown next, which is fabulous. It's the Nevelson Plaza. It's right at Trinity Place. I looked down on it for years because the One Chase Plaza's to the left above it. These are 7 20-foot trees in the Nevelson Plaza. When it was first built, there were no trees or benches, but it's beautiful and it's a fabulous place to sit, which I did many times. Next. Okay, 1980s, glide to the end. And I know I'm running a little short on time. She continued to do major installations. She collected honorary degrees from Princeton, Columbia, universities everywhere. Her work was shown and acquired all around the country avidly through the 80s, and she dies at the age of 89 in 1989. Next. She continues with major installations. This is City on the High Mountain at Storm King, some of which Arnie was showing in his film, which is magnificent if you go to Storm King. Next. These are the charred rafters from the St. Mark's Bowery Church, which burned down, which she collected these charred rafters and created a exhibition. And here she is, 1983, 84. Next. This is, we're going to go very quickly through this, but as I said, she was remarkable not just as an artist, but stamping her identity in her style that, you know, some criticized and said, well, it's going to take away from your work and people won't take you seriously. And they'll think you're too flamboyant. Well, you can imagine her reaction. And she continued on, and we will see how it changed. And Jerry, we'll go through these quickly. This is 22, 32 next, 31, 54, her Gloria Swanson stage next. She's now wearing some of her art, and she now wears a head covering, which she'll wear for the rest of her life. Next. This is very stylized photos by famous photographers. She has her cigarillo in hand in both of them. I should have the names of these, and if anybody inquired, I could tell you they're the Abendens of the world, but I don't know. But this is 72, and she is clearly making her mark by stylistically with the same head wrap. Next. This is, she's on the cover of Intellectual Digest. This is 72, and a magazine called Six that I have no idea what it is. Next. She's now getting into furs and many layered eyelashes, as many as 12 layers, with, again, her head wraps and scarves and furs. Next, she's standing at the Bendix facility that she built. Here she is, I think in her, you know, mid to late 80s with her furs, again, showing the head scarf, that whether plain and simple when she was working or when she was dressed to the nines. Next. Cowboy hat. Furs. Next. I don't know. All kinds of stuff there on the left. And this is a famous photograph, I think, by Cecil Beaton, 1978, in her fur. Probably thinking, oh my God, what a life. Next. And this is the last photo, 1986. Forgetting the photographer, but very famous. And here she's 86 years old and close to the end of her career. And I thought it was fitting next to show the last piece that she created. She created it in 1988. She's 88 she's within a year of her death, and she creates this piece, which I think is incredibly marvelous. I almost want to cry when I'm going to describe it. Last year of her life, she creates something called Mirror Shadow that seems to summarize old age and the artist's life. It's the remnants of a chair pushing through a box, with another box filled with detritus that is swinging free. And finally, a circular form on the shelf, promising, offering some type of openness in maybe some world to come. At her death, the simple wooden chair remained empty, filled with a lifetime of achievements, perhaps a window into the next world. And she said about this piece, "My life is a mirror of my consciousness." And then she died of cancer in the following year. So that concludes our lecture of this amazing artist, which I hope you could get some idea of Louise Nevelson, the third of our great Jewish artists. So I don't know if there are questions. Jerry, how do we organize that?
Everyone unmutes when they want to and asks. Very simple.
Okay. Pretty astounding artist, no? And now I bet many of you will be looking for her work when you pass by public places that you might not have noticed. I certainly have been for the last 2 months.
And where would you suggest, David, if we wanted to go and like see?
Well, she's in all the local museums, whether it's Trenton or Newark, and certainly MoMA and the Met. Jewish Museum, amazingly, only has one piece up right now, which is that self-portrait that I showed. Princeton University has her first core 10 steel structure called Atmospheres and Environments that's right off of Nassau Street. So, but and I would say in virtually every PepsiCo garden, Storm King, every public gardens has a Nevelson.
Where's the Philadelphia Museum of Arts?
Which?
Where's the Philadelphia Museum of Arts large sculpture now? It's not, you don't see it out. You know, it's not at the west entrance or anything.
I didn't realize that. I'm not sure because I'm familiar with it there. So that's a surprise.
Yeah, no, it's empty. It's the whole terrace now, and there's no sculpture right up at the terrace.
That's strange. That was a fabulous sculpture.
I know. It's somewhere. I just didn't know what happened.
Yeah, we'll have to find it.
Wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
David, where is Storm King?
Storm King is on its way up the Hudson Valley. It's about an hour and 3/4 from the city, or an hour and a half. It's right off of the
Thruway,
main highway.
the New York State Thruway.
Yeah, the Thruway. Yeah, that's the one. And it's fabulous. And it has her sculpture. It also has a great Noguchi, and it has a lot of David Smith, who was a very close friend of hers, and she was very close to his wife, Dorothy Daner. But it said that Louise Nevelson held off doing her first metal sculpture until David Smith died, which was in 1965. That's how much she respected him. And it has, that particular public space has a lot of his work.
David, Lauren Lasky and I went to the Jewish Museum and saw those gigantic sculptures, the cube and such. And our only comment is, we wish you had been with us.
I wish I was with you too, no matter what you'd be looking at. Okay.
I just want to thank you, David, for your masterful presentation. You're such a treasure to us. You have our gratitude.
Well, I'm so happy to do it. And it's such a great experience. You know, you can't really get to know an artist unless you immerse yourself. There's just really no other way. And so I've had the privilege so far with these 3 artists of having this amazing experience of their work at a level I never would have, plumbed. So it's my great pleasure and privilege as well. And Frankenthaler next in a month or so. Oh, God. All right,
May 26th.
correct. And she's a treasure. She's amazing. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.